There is something I want you to imagine before this story begins. Imagine you are part of a group, 3 men, with 15, 20, and 21 years of combined training, tournament wins, and bones fractured in real combat. The kind of respect that cannot be bought or inherited is built blow by blow, fall by fall, the 3 of them together in the same dojo, under the same master, with the same certainty that hard training produces in the men who survive it. And someone brings into that room a thin, 5 feet 8 inches, 1.72 meters, 139 pound, 63 kilograms, Chinese man, sitting silently in a chair in the back with a notebook on his knee, still, unannounced, without any gestures of any kind. And that someone says to your master, almost in a whisper, "This is the one who teaches that Chinese art everyone talks about." What do you think? That is what 3 men thought in Los Angeles on a Tuesday night in 1967. And it was exactly that thought, that quiet certainty of what they were going to see, that made what happened afterward impossible to forget. This is that story. But before we begin, if you've made it this far and are not yet subscribed to this channel, this is the time, because this story is exactly the kind of story we tell here, the ones that aren't in textbooks, the ones that make you understand Bruce Lee in a way you hadn't before. Subscribe now, it costs you nothing, and what you are going to hear tonight, I swear, is worth it all. Let's begin. The Tanaka Brothers Dojo was not a pretty place. It was a brick warehouse in East Los Angeles with a wooden floor darkened by decades of sweat and walls hung with black and white photographs of men with black belts who stared at the camera as if the camera had insulted them. The ceiling was low, the lights were yellow. It was 8 p.m. Outside, Los Angeles was doing what Los Angeles always did in 1967, moving, breathing, mixing with an energy that, in that particular year, had a strange electricity. Inside the dojo, that conversation had a very specific version. Master Kenji Mori had been teaching Kyokushinkai in that warehouse for 22 years. Kyokushinkai, the path of absolute truth as they translate it, was, according to its practitioners, the toughest karate in the world, no torso protection during combat, no points for technique, only real impact, real resistance, real result. Mori's students prided themselves on one thing, that when they hit, you knew it, and when someone fell in front of them, they didn't fall because of points, they fell because their body could no longer stay standing. That night, Mori had summoned his 3 best students for a private demonstration. The first was Takeshi Okano, 29 years old, 6 feet 2 inches, 1.88 meters, 207 pounds, 94 kilograms, of muscle built by hitting sandbags for 4 years without fail, 6 days a week. He had won 3 regional tournaments in a row. His training partners said that when Takeshi blocked a strike, the attacker felt the impact in their own bone. The second was Ryo Hashimoto, 31 years old, shorter, 6 feet 0 inches, 1.82 meters, but broader, the kind of man who, when he enters a room, the room seems to shrink. Ryo had studied judo before coming to Kyokushinkai, and that combination gave him something few karateka had. He didn't just know how to destroy from a distance, he knew how to destroy on the ground. The third was the youngest, Daiki Mori, the master's nephew, 26 years old, thin, almost gaunt compared to the other 2, but with a speed his peers described as something difficult to process. He wasn't the strongest in the room, he was the fastest. And in Kyokushinkai, speed plus technique plus intention produced something physicists would call momentum and what the people in that dojo simply called destruction. That night, there were about 30 men sitting on the edges of the tatami, instructors from other dojos, practitioners of karate, judo, aikido, and some journalists from martial arts magazines, which at that time were small publications circulating among initiates, but which had considerable influence in the world of fighting styles. And there was one more person, sitting alone in a wooden chair against the back wall, in black training clothes, with a small notebook on his left knee, was a young, thin man of slight build with dark-rimmed glasses, who watched everything with a calm that, depending on how it was interpreted, could seem like modesty or could seem like something completely different. His name was not on that night's program. No one had announced him. Someone had brought him, someone who knew Master Mori and who, for reasons that would become clearer that night, had considered the presence of that man might be interesting. Kenji Mori looked toward the chair in the back, then looked at his students and said something quietly to the person sitting next to him, an older man with a mustache who was the connection between that world and the visitor in the chair. That's the one who teaches that Chinese dance. The person with the mustache smiled slightly. He calls it Kung Fu. Mori nodded slowly. Kung Fu, he repeated with the tone of someone who had just confirmed something he already knew. The man in the chair in the back couldn't hear that conversation, but he looked up from his notebook at that moment, as if something in the air had changed temperature, and met Master Mori's eyes from the other side of the room. He held the gaze for exactly as long as was necessary to make it impossible to ignore. Then he went back to his notebook. His name was Bruce Lee, and that night, in that brick warehouse in East Los Angeles, he was going to learn something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and that would change Kung Fu, not because it was ineffective, but because from the outside, it was impossible to distinguish between Kung Fu as a real combat art and Kung Fu as a spectacle. That spectacle was exactly the problem. The Kyokushinkai karateka, in particular, had a very clear opinion. Kung Fu was dance, it was theater, it was cultural tradition with historical value, perhaps, but it was not combat. Master Mori's demonstration began at 8:15. His 3 students worked in pairs first, combinations of strikes and blocks that filled the room with the dry sound of real impact, the kind of sound that is nothing like movie karate and that makes the spectators involuntarily tense their own muscles. Takeshi Okano took 3 direct strikes to the body without moving. Ryo Hashimoto projected an 80 kilograms man 1.5 meters away with a hip technique that lasted less than a second. Daiki Mori chained 5 movements in 3 seconds that those present took time to process because the human eye wasn't designed to track that speed. It was impressive, it was genuinely impressive. Bruce Lee watched it all from his chair. The notebook had disappeared, now he had his elbows on his knees and his chin on his clenched fists. His eyes registered everything with that quality of attention that people who knew him described as something difficult to describe. It wasn't scrutiny, it wasn't admiration, it was something closer to what a clock does when it calibrates. After 20 minutes, Master Mori walked to the center of the tatami. He spoke in Japanese. The person with the mustache translated into English for those present who didn't understand. We have shown what real training produces: strength, speed, impact. These things cannot be simulated, they cannot be decorated. They either exist or they do not. Pause. We have heard a lot about a Chinese art that produces similar things. We have seen demonstrations, we have seen beautiful things. Another pause. We would like to see something real. The silence that followed in the room had a specific texture. It was the silence of 30 people who had just understood what was about to happen and who still didn't know how they were going to react to it. Bruce Lee got up from his chair. He didn't do it with urgency. He didn't do it with the theatrical gesture of someone accepting a challenge in a movie. He got up slowly, like someone getting up from the table after a long meal, and walked to the center of the tatami. He was a third narrower than Takeshi Okano. That difference was visible, not because Bruce Lee seemed weak, no one who looked into his eyes for more than 3 seconds would think that, but because in that space, surrounded by men built by years of impact and mass, the scale difference was simply a physical fact that the room registered. Someone among the spectators made a quiet comment, another responded with a brief laugh. Bruce Lee didn't look that way. He looked at Master Mori and asked in quiet English, 3? Mori nodded. If you agree, I agree, Bruce Lee said, and then added something that half the room heard and the other half didn't, but which those who heard it remembered for a long time. But I need you to understand that what is going to happen here tonight does not represent Kung Fu. It represents what I can do today. Tomorrow it might be different. No one fully understood that sentence at the time. They would understand it later. Okano was the first, not because of particular protocol, but because Okano was the type of man who moved to the front in situations like this naturally, like water seeking the lowest level. It was his place, it was what he had trained to be, the first to enter. Bruce Lee watched him approach and something in his posture changed, a sort of subtle reorganization, a redistribution of weight that didn't change what you saw, but completely changed what it was. From a man standing to a system in a state of maximum alert. Okano launched the first attack. It wasn't an exhibition move, it was a real strike launched with the speed and intention of someone who makes no difference between a demonstration and combat, a direct strike to the low body, seeking the plexus. It didn't connect, not because Bruce Lee blocked it, but because Bruce Lee was no longer where he had been. He had rotated just a few centimeters and Okano's fist passed by his ribs like water passing around a rock. And before Okano could process that, he felt pressure on his forearm that threw him off balance forward. It wasn't a strike, it was a redirection, the type of technique that in Southern Kung Fu is called Chi Sa, sticky hands, that uses the opponent's momentum as fuel for one's own movement. Okano recovered in a second and returned to his stance. The room was completely silent. Okano attacked again, this time a combination, high strike, middle kick. And this time, Bruce Lee didn't just redirect, he responded, an open palm that reached a centimeter from Okano's chin before stopping, and then a quick step backward that put 2 meters between them before Okano could react. The palm had stopped, there had been no contact. In Kyokushinkai, that didn't count, in Bruce Lee's style, it was a statement, I was here, I could, I chose not to. Okano understood the language, and that language irritated him. What came next was different. Okano stopped doing controlled combat. He started doing what he did when he really wanted to end something, lower center of gravity, shorter range of motion, more direct angle of attack, no flourishes, no room for redirection, pushing forward with mass and speed and the pure intention of driving Bruce Lee against the wall. And he succeeded. Bruce Lee absorbed a blow to the left shoulder that moved him back, then another to his side, a body blow that connected, that really connected. And those present heard the sound and saw Bruce Lee bend his torso slightly and take steps back. He didn't fall, but he had received something. Someone among the spectators exhaled, someone else leaned forward. Bruce Lee straightened up, ran his tongue over his lower lip. There was no blood yet, but there was the type of sensation that precedes blood. He looked at Okano, and then he did something no one in that room expected. He smiled. Not an act of smiling, not the smile of someone pretending it didn't hurt. It was a small, almost private smile, like that of someone who had just verified something they suspected but needed to confirm, as if that blow wasn't a problem, but information. Okano frowned. In 15 years of Kyokushinkai, no one had smiled after receiving that. Before I tell you what happened next, and what happened next is the part of this story that the people who were there describe as something they don't have the fully adequate words to describe, I want to tell you something. There is a question that this story asks, and that goes beyond who won or who lost in that dojo. The question is, what does a man do when he discovers that what he learned all his life is not enough for the situation he is in? Does he hold on, collapse, or adapt? That question is exactly the heart of everything Bruce Lee was. And if you want to understand that question in depth, not just in the context of martial arts, but in the context of how he lived, how he thought, how he trained, what he ate, how he structured his mind, there is a place where all of that is gathered. It is called the Bruce Lee Code. It is the book we wrote for those who don't settle for admiring Bruce Lee from the outside, but for those who want to understand the complete system that made him possible, philosophy, training, diet, discipline, everything in a single volume. You find it in the video description, both on Amazon and Hotmart. And if you are a subscriber to this channel, if you have already pressed that red button, you have access to something that is not available to anyone else, the coupon Legado20. 20% discount on the purchase through Hotmart, exclusive to this community. Only for those who are here, only for those who chose to stay. The link is in the description. The coupon is Legado20. Now let's go back to that room. Ryo Hashimoto entered before Okano had finished withdrawing. It wasn't part of the original plan. In any formal confrontation, participants wait their turn. But in Kyokushinkai, when a partner takes longer than expected to resolve something, there is a group instinct that sometimes overcomes protocol. Hashimoto entered because he had seen Bruce Lee absorb that blow and stay standing with that smile, and something in that needed an immediate response. Master Mori watched from the side and said nothing. What was happening had surpassed the demonstration format. It was something different, and Mori, a man of discipline before anything else, recognized when a situation had its own logic. Hashimoto combined what Okano hadn't been able to complete. If Okano was linear force, Hashimoto was rotational mass. He used the judo of his early training to seek the grip, to take Bruce Lee out of the vertical plane where his distance techniques worked, and lead him to the horizontal plane where 90 kilograms of his own weight would be the definitive argument. The first attempt to grip was intercepted, the second too, the third not. Hashimoto found Bruce Lee's arm, turned with his hip, and what happened in the next second and a half was the type of movement that in judo is called uchimata, an inner thigh sweep executed with the precision of someone who had practiced it 10,000 times. And the result was that Bruce Lee went flying. It wasn't a soft fall, it was a real fall. He impacted the tatami with his left shoulder and rolled, and when he stopped, he was on the floor 3 meters from where he had been, with the left side of his face toward the dark wood of the tatami and his eyes open, looking at the yellow ceiling of that warehouse. The room didn't make any sound for what seemed like 3 seconds, but was probably 1. Hashimoto remained in a combat stance waiting. Bruce Lee didn't get up immediately. He remained on the floor, not unconscious, not paralyzed, but clearly processing something. He blinked. He breathed. His right hand flat against the tatami, and in the eyes of those present who could see his face from that angle, there wasn't what they would have expected to see. There was no confusion, there was no panic. There was that same quality of a clock calibrating. When he stood up, and he stood up slowly, carefully, like someone who is taking inventory while he does it, there was something visibly different in how he stood. It wasn't the same posture, it wasn't the same weight distribution, something had changed. Later, much later, Bruce Lee would describe that moment in a letter to a close friend as follows: "On the ground, I understood what I had been doing wrong. It wasn't the kung fu, it was me. I had kept being the same while the situation changed. Water doesn't do that, only I did. But that was later." At that moment, in that dojo, the only thing those present saw was a man standing up from the tatami with a slight dark stain on his left cheekbone, which would be an impressive bruise by the next day, and who looked at Hashimoto with eyes that no longer belonged to the same situation from a minute ago. What Bruce Lee did in the following 4 minutes in that dojo is the part of this story that his biographers would have wanted to document with a camera and that, unfortunately for formal history, no one had. But there is something better than a camera. There are 30 people who saw it, and their testimonies, collected in private conversations over the years, agree on the details that matter. They agree that what changed wasn't the speed. Bruce Lee had already been fast from the beginning. It wasn't the precision. He had already shown precision. What changed was the organizing principle. Before falling, Bruce Lee had fought in a recognizable way, Wing Chun and Southern Kung Fu techniques that sought the correct distance, redirection, control without destruction, elegant, effective to a point, but built on a system with rules. After getting up from the tatami, the rules had disappeared. There was no technique that named what he did afterward. There was no system that classified it. When Hashimoto tried the second grip, he didn't find Bruce Lee's arm where it should have been. He found a pressure point on his neck that came from an angle that judo has no name for, and he felt something those who do leverage arts know well, the kind of sensation that tells the body, before the brain processes the information, that moving forward is an idea that is going to end very badly. Hashimoto stopped. Daiki Mori, the nephew, the youngest, the fastest, entered at that moment, and Daiki was fast. He was genuinely fast, the type of speed that makes it difficult for the human eye to track movements, that produces that strange sensation that the action occurred before your brain registered it. Daiki's first combination was spectacular. It came from 3 angles in less than 2 seconds, low kick, middle hand, high elbow, and 2 of the 3 connected. Bruce Lee retreated, his lip was split. There was blood, this time a fine line at the corner, and those present saw it and the room had that involuntary reaction that crowds have when something crosses a threshold. But Bruce Lee didn't wipe his lip, he didn't check the damage, he didn't do any of the things we do instinctively when we bleed. He simply waited. Daiki launched the second combination, and this is where the moment happened that the room took years to describe without feeling that words were not enough, because Bruce Lee didn't block, didn't redirect, didn't dodge. He went in. He went in directly toward the attack, not on the line of the blows, but between them, in the space that exists between the first technique and the second. when the combination is in process and the attacker is already committed to the movement. And in that space, which lasted something a high-precision clock would measure in milliseconds, he placed his open palm on Daiki Mori's chest, exactly on the sternum. He didn't strike, he pressed, and Daiki Mori, 26, Kyokushinkai, the fastest in that room, felt all the momentum of his own body reverse and ended up sitting on the tatami facing up, with an expression that those present invariably described in the same way, genuine confusion. Not pain, not defeat in the physical sense, confusion, like someone who just solved an equation and discovered that the result makes no sense and needs to check all the steps from the beginning. Master Mori raised his hand. He said nothing for several seconds. The room also said nothing. 30 people who had entered that dojo with a formed opinion and who now had something inside them that opinion had no room to contain. Finally, Mori walked to the center of the tatami. Takeshi Okano and Ryo Hashimoto had retreated to the sides. Daiki Mori was still on the floor, not because he couldn't get up, but because at that moment the floor seemed the most honest place to be. Mori looked at Bruce Lee for a long moment, then bowed his head. It wasn't a deep bow, it was a forward tilt of the shoulders, sustained, of someone who recognizes something without needing to explain it. Bruce Lee returned the bow. There was blood on his lip. There was a bruise forming on his cheekbone. He had a left shoulder that was going to hurt for 3 days, and he had the expression of someone who hadn't won the night the way he had expected to win it, and who for that reason had won something completely different. The man with the mustache who had brought Bruce Lee approached him as they were leaving and asked him in a low voice if he was okay. Bruce Lee considered the question for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said finally. The person with the mustache didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "What I learned tonight is going to change how I train. I don't know if that's good or if it's the best moment, but there is no way not to learn it now." In the months following that night, something changed fundamentally in the system Bruce Lee was building. He didn't call it change, he called it honesty. He started to document it with an intensity that his close circle recognized as a sign that he had found something important. Notebooks he filled in the early morning, diagrams that mixed movement notation with philosophy, questions he asked himself in the margins of the pages that had no answer but in the next training and the next and the next. What that night in the Tanaka dojo had shown him was something Bruce Lee already knew intellectually, but now knew in the only way that makes a difference, in the body. It had shown him that no system is complete, that elegance without effectiveness is decoration, that effectiveness without adaptation is fragility disguised as strength. And it had shown him, in the second he was on the ground looking at the yellow ceiling of that warehouse, that the only question that mattered was not which art is better, but what does this specific situation need at this specific moment? Jeet Kune Do, the art that Bruce Lee would formalize in the years to follow, the system without a system that would forever change how the world thought about combat, was not born that night. It had been gestating for years. But that night was when Bruce Lee touched the ground, and touching the ground was what allowed him to get up differently. Master Mori spoke about that night once in an interview he gave decades later to a small martial arts publication in Osaka. He came to demonstrate Kung Fu, but what he demonstrated had no name. It wasn't the Kung Fu I knew, it was something he was creating in real time, in front of me. I had seen many things in 22 years of teaching, but I hadn't seen anyone change systems in the middle of combat. That isn't taught, that is, either you have it or you don't. Takeshi Okano, in a private conversation years later, was more direct. "I thought it was going to be easy, and at a certain point, it was easy. We threw him to the floor. But what he did after getting up made no sense to me. I don't even know if it was Kung Fu, I don't know what to call it. I only know that, when his hand stopped in front of my face and I hadn't seen it coming, I understood something I had never needed to understand before, that there is a speed that training alone doesn't explain." And Daiki Mori, the youngest, the one who ended up sitting on the tatami with that expression of an equation without a solution, left Kyokushinkai 16 months after that night. He didn't do it dramatically, there was no declaration, he simply stopped going. He started studying Wing Chun. The story of Kung Fu as dance doesn't end that night in Los Angeles. There are people who still say it, that Kung Fu is spectacle, that it is valuable cultural tradition but not real combat, that its forms are performance art and not martial art in the sense that matters when the situation is real. There is some truth to that, just as there is some truth to every simplification that mixes what is correct with what is incomplete. But what Bruce Lee demonstrated that night, and what he spent his entire life demonstrating, was not that Kung Fu could defeat karate. It wasn't about that. It was never about that. What he demonstrated was harder to see, but more impossible to ignore once you saw it, that the system that does not question itself becomes its own prison, that the highest form of any martial art is not technique. It is the ability not to cling to any technique when the situation requires something different, that the tree that survives the storm is not the most rigid, but the one that knows when to be root and when to be branch. On the floor of that dojo, with a swollen eye and blood on his lip, Bruce Lee didn't lose. He received a gift that was hard to receive, the information that no controlled training could have given him. And what he did with that information changed Kung Fu, changed martial arts, changed for millions of people who never stepped into a dojo the way of thinking about what it means to be willing to be brought down by the truth. If this story moved something in you, if at any moment while listening to it you felt there was something there that went beyond two men in a dojo, that there was something about how we function when the system we know stops being enough, then there is something I want you to consider. Everything that made Bruce Lee is documented, not just what the legend built around him, but the training system he developed after nights like this, the philosophy he wrote in private notebooks, the diet he designed with scientific precision before that concept existed in mass sports, the discipline that structured every hour of his life when no one was watching. All that is in the Bruce Lee Code, the book that gathers in one place what is not in movies, nor in interviews, nor in Wikipedia summaries. If you are a subscriber to this channel, you have access to the coupon Legado20. 20% discount exclusive to this community, only on Hotmart. It is not published anywhere else, it is yours for being part of here. The link is in the description, the coupon is Legado20. There is one last thing I want to leave you with. The night after that demonstration, Bruce Lee was in his house in Los Angeles. The cheekbone was already the color you would expect, the shoulder limited him, and according to people close to him who described that period, he was sitting on the floor of his studio, not in a chair, on the floor, with 3 notebooks open and a cup of tea that had gone cold a long time ago because he hadn't stopped writing. One of his closest students arrived that night to check that he was okay, found the notebooks, found the diagrams, asked him what he was doing. Bruce Lee looked up and said something that student repeated many times in the years that followed, with the consistency of someone who knows they are quoting something that deserves to be repeated. I am erasing what I know to see what remains. At that moment, that student didn't know exactly what he meant. Years later, when Jeet Kune Do had changed the world of martial arts and Bruce Lee was a figure that was already more than a man, that student understood, it wasn't about forgetting. It was about letting go of the need for what you knew to be enough. Letting go of that, the certainty, the identity built on what you master, that is the most difficult movement that exists, more difficult than any technique, more difficult than any combat. And Bruce Lee did it on the floor of a brick warehouse in East Los Angeles, with a swollen eye and blood on his lip when no one was filming him. That is what it means to leave a legacy. If you made it to the end of this story, leave a like now, not because I am asking you, but because you know this wasn't a 5-minute video, it was a complete story. And those who made it here are exactly the type of people who make it worth building this channel. And tell me in the comments this, the moment Bruce Lee was on the floor looking at the ceiling, would you have gotten up the same way, or would you have taken the easy way out? There is no correct answer, but I am interested in yours. If you are not yet subscribed, the button is there. This is the community where these stories live. Until next time.